He has to sell this to Ukraine. He has to sell Ukraine to Russia. Trump commented on Witkoff's conversation with Putin's aide and called it standard for negotiations. He has no chance of winning the war. Chancellor Merz has already explained what Putin needs to understand, commented on Trump's plan, and promised new aid for Ukraine. The Russians keep throwing more and more reserves at Pokrovsk while there are defensive corridors leading to Mirnograd. Heavy fighting, Podgulai field, everything that's happening right now on the front line. We'll tell you all the details very soon. Adam Kadyrov, 18, now the unhinged son of a criminal father, has come of age. We'll share the details of his creative journey and his vague plans for the future. By the way, we won't forget those either. Now, let's get into everything in detail, but in the meantime, don't forget to like this episode and subscribe to the Ukraine Today YouTube channel. Bloomberg has published transcripts of a phone conversation between U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Russian presidential aide Yuri Ushakov. According to the released transcripts, Witkoff gives the Kremlin advice on how to sell Trump on Russia's terms for peace regarding Ukraine. In addition, a recording was published of Ushakov's conversation with Putin's special envoy Kirill Dmitriev, in which they discussed how to present the Russian plan for ending the war as an American one. This incident, which instantly stirred diplomatic offices on both sides of the Atlantic, even led members of the U.S. Republican Party to speak of treason by Witkoff. U.S. President Donald Trump commented on the transcript of his special envoy's conversation with aides to the Russian dictator Putin, which was published by Bloomberg. He called his representative's behavior typical for someone who makes deals. Quote, "This is standard practice. He has to sell this to Ukraine. He has to sell Ukraine to Russia. That's what a deal maker does." Trump also emphasized that effective negotiations always involve a certain amount of pressure and persuasion on both sides. And he noted that he personally had not heard the released audio, but sees nothing unusual in Witkoff's approach. And now about what is happening these days at the official negotiations on war and peace in the following report from our journalists.
No restrictions for the armed forces of Ukraine, no ban on joining NATO, and much more. The so-called Trump plan in its original form no longer exists. According to the Financial Times, it has been reduced by almost a third. However, the details have not yet been disclosed.
As of now, after Geneva, there are fewer points, no longer 28, and many important aspects have been taken into account in this framework. There is still work to be done even now. It's very difficult to create the final document, and everything must be done properly. And we appreciate that the majority of the sources that we have reviewed and considered
Informed about the course of the negotiations, report that all parties have agreed to continue discussing only issues related to bilateral relations between Ukraine and the United States. Certain topics should be considered in other formats, since the original version of the document included nuances that did not depend on Ukraine at all. Now, by presenting a united front, Europe and Ukraine have decided to discuss their respective issues with the United States while taking each other's interests into account.
This partnership not only allows us to act together as a team, but it also demonstrates that shared interests essentially create a strong foundation for acting together.
At the same time, to prevent leaks, no copies of the new peace agreement were handed out after the meeting, reported Ukraine's first Deputy Foreign Minister Serhiy Kyslytsya. All copies of the document agreed upon in Geneva were collected from everyone except the heads of the delegations. Nevertheless, some details still leaked to the press at the level of rumors. For example, there was an unequivocal refusal to reduce the number of BSUs.
Our European partners made it very clear that Ukraine's sovereignty cannot be discussed at all, and any restrictions on the army or on Ukraine's ability to join this or that alliance also have no right to be discussed. And from this point of view, it is clearly quite obvious that demands, for example, to amend the constitution of Ukraine regarding non-accession to NATO will be dropped. And it seems to me that these are the main important points.
Another crucial point for Ukraine was the discussion of security guarantees. According to analysts, Washington's representatives managed to convey that such commitments from the Russian Federation mean absolutely nothing. Therefore, the only guarantees can be agreements with the US and Europe, as well as the unhindered development of the defense industry within Ukraine itself. And here, for the first time, it was stated that these are guarantees not only for Ukraine, but for the entire continent.
It's important that in Europe, people are talking about guaranteeing peace through strength. In other words, European countries are now, for the first time, officially and openly stating and declaring that we must be fully prepared and ready to fight, to engage in military conflict against Russia. This includes the possibility of fighting on Ukrainian territory if, after the signing of a peace agreement, Russia violates or fails to uphold the terms and conditions of that agreement. And this particular moment, it really seems to me, marks what can only be described as a truly significant and tectonic shift. Because as we know, previously, such things were simply never discussed at all, not even mentioned in passing.
At the same time, the White House believes that the negotiations to end the war in Ukraine were productive, but a few disagreements remain, said White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre following the meeting. She also said in an interview with Fox News that arms supplies to Ukraine have their limits and cannot be endless, subtly hinting at what might happen to US aid if Kyiv pushes its position too aggressively. However, even when it comes to weapons, things are far from straightforward.
It is Europe that is buying American weapons for Ukraine. They are actually buying them. And from this point of view, Trump's threats, which he voiced not to supply weapons to Ukraine, are in fact a violation of agreements not only with Ukraine but also with Europe. As for
the loss of multi-billion-dollar contracts and the payment of penalties for breaking them, that's clearly not what Donald Trump is counting on. Meanwhile, the American delegation is already in Abu Dhabi, where several days of meetings will be held with the Russian side. A peace plan, agreed upon on Sunday between the US and Ukraine, will be presented to the Russian Federation. According to experts, given that earlier statements from Moscow sounded like "we haven't seen anything and need to look into the matter," this time the Kremlin also doesn't seem particularly inclined toward constructive dialogue.
But this gives the Russian Federation the opportunity to build a system in which they won't even, so to speak, get involved or consider this plan. In this way, they are trying to keep the initiative on their side and avoid getting drawn into this negotiation process. Because getting involved would essentially mean playing by someone else's rules, by the rules of Kyiv, Europe, and Washington. Once again, Moscow does not want to be in a position where it is being led, and when it is perceived, first and foremost by the United States, as the key barrier to achieving peace.
However, as analysts say, no one really expects that Putin will agree to terms acceptable to Europe without pressure. And this pressure should primarily come from Washington. Which means the main task is to convince the United States that the peace plan should be exactly like this.
Judging by the fact that the negotiations did not drag on for long and ended with a friendly dinner, these are clearly signals and signs that everything went more than positively, more than well. And we know the character is quite complex. Steve Witkoff, a man who is both extremely wealthy and extremely capricious, would never have agreed, even, let's say, for the sake of politeness. He would not have agreed to simply have dinner and spend his time if he thought that the results of the negotiations did not satisfy him.
Meanwhile, to ensure that Trump himself would not deviate from the course of peaceful settlement agreed upon at the meeting, the closest friends of the American leader in European politics, President of Finland Alexander Stubb, and Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, flew to Washington. They have already demonstrated more than once that they know how to find an approach to Donald Trump.
The armed forces of Ukraine have withdrawn to more advantageous positions near Vysoke in the Zaporizhzhia region in the direction of Huliaipolo. According to Ukraine's defense forces, the village has not been occupied yet. Fighting for it is still ongoing. The General Staff of the Armed Forces also confirmed a strike on a plant in Cheboksary, which manufactures navigation equipment and components for cruise and ballistic missiles. A command post in Zaporizhzhia was also hit. More on the situation at the front line in our military review.
One of the longest and most massive since the start of the full-scale war. This is how the head of the Krasnodar region, Veniamin Kondratiev, described the nighttime attack on his region. Drones also visited the Russian city of Taganrog in the Rostov region. An aircraft manufacturing plant was attacked there. The Ukrainian General Staff confirmed the destruction of a Russian experimental A-60 aircraft, as well as a drone manufacturing facility.
This aircraft is equipped with laser equipment, and it is the only one of its kind in the Russian aerospace forces. That is why this is an unprecedentedly successful strike by Ukraine's defense forces against legitimate military targets on the territory of the occupying country.
In addition, in Novorossiysk, Russia, a hit was recorded at an oil terminal. Stenders and a launcher from an S-400 air defense system warehouse were struck. the Tuapse oil refinery was hit.
Let me remind you of the tactical and technical characteristics of the bars. It's about 700 kilometers. The target engagement range, warhead weight, is from 50 to 100 kilograms. The length of the Neptune target engagement range is about 1,000 kilometers. Therefore, striking legitimate military targets on the territory of the Russian Federation is further proof of the successful work of the Ukrainian defense industry.
It is not safe even in the Russian digital space. Ukrainian hackers hacked the alert system in Krasnodar Krai, as a result of which a chemical and radiation alarm was triggered there. Instead of defending their regions, the Russian army fired at Ukrainians. A video has surfaced online showing at least 8 calibers of ammunition being launched from Novorossiysk in Ukraine.
There they fly, the 8th one has gone. The King and the Volt are flying. Tsar and
At the same time, the Russians attacked residential buildings in which civilians were sleeping. The president of Ukraine stated that the enemy struck several regions of our country, but the epicenter was Kyiv. According to him, the occupiers sent more than 460 drones into Ukraine, 4 of which flew.
Into the countries of Moldova and Romania, particularly during a period when crucial and highly significant international meetings were taking place, which made the timing of these events especially important.
The situation on the front line remains tense. The occupying army is trying to break through in Pokrovsk.
Ukrainian defense forces managed to carry out a sweep almost in the city center. This refers to the successful actions of Ukrainian assault units in the area of the Pokrovsk Pedagogical College, Soborna Square, and the railway station. In addition, Ukrainian defense forces have expanded their presence both in Pokrovsk itself and accordingly have carried out a number of successful counterattacks.
The defenders of the Kupiansk direction are not allowing the occupiers to break through the Ukrainian defenses. Here, the Russians are trying to break through with small assault groups, but they are immediately stopped by the Ukrainian armed forces. Our defenders are employing active defense tactics in the Zaporizhia direction and, whenever possible, launch counterattacks.
due to astronomical losses, Russia is forced to throw reserve forces into the assault on Pokrovsk. The Ukrainian armed forces have also managed to organize defensive corridors to Mirnohrad to deliver everything necessary to the defenders and evacuate the wounded. This was reported by the East Military Grouping. In Pokrovsk, search and strike operations continue to identify and eliminate Russian invaders. Fighting is ongoing in the city, and the occupiers are also sending small groups into the central part of Pokrovsk, whose task is to create footage for propaganda media, according to the defenders. The occupiers are trying to infiltrate the southern part of the city, taking advantage of the weather conditions. At the same time, Ukrainian armed forces fighters are not allowing the enemy to advance northward. The invaders had planned to capture Pokrovsk by September. It is now the end of November, but fighting in the city continues. As a result of fierce battles, the enemy is suffering huge losses and has already been forced to deploy reserves, our defenders noted. In addition, the enemy is trying to cut off logistics between Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad. The Russians are trying to enter Mirnohrad, but the defense forces are thwarting the enemy's offensive plans, destroying them along with their equipment. It is possible to successfully escape from the Russian army and find safety outside the borders of Putin's evil empire. This is proven by the experience of Volodymyr Bernhardt. He is now far from the front line, out of danger of death and away from his pursuers. Here is the story of a successful escape and advice for those Russians who want to break free from the meat grinder of the Russian army.
Volodymyr Bernhardt, an ordinary Russian man from the town of Abinsk in Krasnodar Krai. In September 2022, he was mobilized into the Russian army. He is a patriot and a decent citizen. He was loyal to the Kremlin's policies and supported the so-called special military operation. But after finding himself in the hell of war, he radically changed his point of view.
There is no justice, and it turns out that our state, represented by our leaders, does not create this justice, does not want to achieve it, and does not want to foster it.
Vladimir served for more than 2 years in a medical evacuation company. He saved soldiers and provided them with first aid. 3 months after he began his service, his views became anti-war. In 2023, the man started a blog on Telegram and a YouTube channel called Cossack's Diary, where he reported directly from the front lines about local assaults and the attitude of the officers toward ordinary soldiers. For this, Vladimir was thrown into a pit, beaten, and even threatened with being zeroed out. But the truth teller did not give up.
In December 2024, I didn't return to the front after my leave and went on the run. I lived in the forest, tried to catch fish and game, and gathered berries and mushrooms. In August 2025, I tried to cross the border between Russia and Georgia illegally, reaching it through the mountains on a motorcycle. I couldn't do it legally. First of all, I was put on the federal wanted list because of a criminal case for unauthorized absence from my unit. Secondly, I didn't have a valid Russian or international passport.
After 10 months of wandering and a failed attempt to leave Russia, Vladimir was unable to cross the border into Georgia. He returned to his private house in Abinsk, where he began to devise a new plan to escape the country. He considered fleeing to Finland, Azerbaijan, or Armenia. He even thought about living in a hut in Siberia. But after some time, the neighbors reported Vladimir to the authorities. He was detained a few hundred meters from his house.
They put handcuffs on me, forced me face down to the ground, and started beating me. They hit me with the butt of a rifle and kicked me with their boots. Fortunately, I used to practice universal combat and know how to turn away to soften the blows. My teeth and ribs remained intact. One of the officers beating me asked if I had any knives. "Where are my documents and money?" He asked about the money 2 or 3 times. I pointed out where everything was. Later, it turned out that I was missing more than 80,000 rubles, almost all the money I had planned to use to escape.
Vladimir was held in the military commandant's office building in a cage with 4 other detainees. They had to sleep on the floor, food was brought to them, and they were taken to the bathroom under guard. After 3 weeks of hellish conditions, the man was taken for interrogation by FSB officers. They told him that a criminal case was being prepared against him for spreading fake news, for posts about what was really happening on the front line. The prospect of 2 criminal cases, a lenient sentence, and then being sent back to the front line. Vladimir once again started thinking about an escape plan. At that time, he and several dozen other escapees were sent to a military unit in the Krasnodar region where they were kept under military guard. During this time, Vladimir established a reputation as a deserter who had come to his senses. He was issued a new Russian Federation passport. I
woke up at 4 a.m., went to the bathroom, and saw that the entire shift of guards was asleep. I walked past them, jumped over the fence, made my way through the bushes, got into the city and called a taxi. And I went to the place where my motorcycle and the things that had been prepared for me in advance were waiting. Then I set off on my motorcycle toward the border with Belarus.
The man had to evade the traffic police several times, crashed his motorcycle, and had to throw away some of his gear. After that, he continued his journey by hitchhiking, using BlaBlaCar, and taking taxis. After 2 weeks on the run, he made it to Smolensk, from where he set out on foot toward the border with Belarus.
I'm walking along a beaten path. It's more comfortable for me here than over there with the barracks. It's 160 meters to the field of mushrooms.
He managed to cross the border without encountering any border guards. In Belarus, Vladimir exchanged money, rented a room, and got himself cleaned up. After that, he bought a ticket and flew to another country. Now, after everything he has been through, Vladimir understands that a new difficult life in exile awaits him. And that is something he will never forgive the Kremlin for.
Most likely, I will never return to my homeland, even though I always wanted to live only in Russia. At the very least, I will dedicate part of my life to fighting the Putin regime within the means available to me. I will never forgive him for destroying hundreds of thousands of lives and forcing me to part with my loved ones and my homeland. In almost a year of my desertion, counting from last December when I didn't return to the war after my leave, I have never once doubted my decision. Under no circumstances am I ever willing to return to the front. At war, I became a pacifist, and I am not willing to betray my values and principles.
The Russian dictator Putin must understand that he has no chance of winning the war in Ukraine. At the same time, if he truly wanted peace, he would stop his aggressive actions as soon as possible. Friedrich Merz stated this during his speech in the Bundestag. He emphasized that Germany will continue to help Ukraine and will support the idea of using frozen Russian assets, which could be allocated for this purpose. At this fateful moment for Ukraine, for Europe, and for our alliance with America, I must also state clearly that European affairs can only be decided in agreement with Europe. Europe is not a pawn, but a sovereign player that pursues its own interests and values, said the Chancellor. Merz also stated that Germany will increase its support for Ukraine next year to a total of 11.5 billion euros. China is fleecing Russia dry? Here's a concrete case. Amid import restrictions due to sanctions, Chinese exporters are raising prices for Russian buyers of military-industrial products, taking advantage of the Kremlin's dependence on these supplies. Prices for Chinese products whose exports are controlled have risen by an average of 87% for Russians, according to a study by the Bank of Finland's Institute for Emerging Economies. We'll take a closer look at how China is ripping off Russia next.
China is betraying Russia. Yes, you heard that right. Beijing masterfully pretends to be a partner, but in reality it uses Moscow as the weak link. And
in our country there's a phrase that has become a saying. The Russian and the Chinese are brothers forever. But
here's what's interesting. Recently, Xi spoke on the phone with Trump and stated that he supports the US peace efforts regarding the resolution of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. It sounds nice in words, but what about in practice?
I think that China has sent a political signal to the United States, indicating that it is closely monitoring what is happening in terms of peaceful regulation and the search for peaceful solutions in the Russia-Ukraine war. The main points of this signal should be as follows. It is important to emphasize that Russia absolutely must not be allowed to win this war, and accordingly, Ukraine under no circumstances should be allowed to lose.
But here's something else. The leaders of the countries have agreed on visits, and Trump is planning to go to China as early as April.
Whether Trump will be able to reach the desired trade agreement with China, specifically in April, for example, during a potential meeting in Beijing, is a big question. Nothing deeper than that, in my opinion, especially on the issue. There's no mention of ending the Russia-Ukraine war within these timeframes. April 2026, a meeting between Trump and Xi Jinping in Beijing, none of that. But
what exactly is China doing wrong in relation to Russia? It seems like everything is fine. The thing is, China is making a lot of money off Russia. The prices of export goods supplied to Russia have increased by an average of 87%.
Relations between Russia and China have always been very complicated. And if we think they're friends, no, there's actually a good word for this. They're fellow travelers. Russia and China are fellow travelers. It's beneficial for China. A weak Russia, a weak Putin is beneficial for China. It's beneficial for China to buy raw materials cheaply. It's beneficial for China to then sell goods to the Russian Federation at a very high price. Russia basically has no other way out anymore. And
it's not just about goods. China is gradually entering Russian regions, thereby gaining access to territories and resources.
You know, there are already examples in the Far East where small settlements have become predominantly Chinese, and now they even participate in municipal elections there.
And Russia, in turn, is becoming increasingly dependent on China.
And does Putin find such a relationship acceptable? Again, of course not. Of course he doesn't. Well, because Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, has lingering phantom pains about the collapse of the Soviet Union. Basically, throughout his entire presidency, he has tried to restore some kind of former greatness. He calls himself a gatherer of Russian lands. But in reality, he is simply leading the Russian Federation to ruin, to complete absolute ruin, to financial bankruptcy.
Beijing is increasingly strengthening its influence in Central Asia while pushing Moscow into the background, which likely cannot help but worry the old man in the Kremlin. It is necessary
to unwaveringly strengthen the friendship between China and Kazakhstan, to make joint efforts to promote comprehensive cooperation and to contribute more to peace in the region and the world, as well as to the development of stability and positive energy in Chinese-Kazakh relations.
Here is the main question. What exactly is driving China? Is it a true partnership with Russia?
Our close and ongoing communication clearly reflects the highly strategic and multifaceted nature of Russian-Chinese relations, which, as we know, are at an unprecedentedly high level, except.
Or is Beijing simply taking advantage of the situation and acting in its own interests?
They are not particularly interested in the Russian Federation winning this war, because if President Putin wins, he effectively restores his full geopolitical agency and begins to engage in discussions with all the major players on the world stage. For example, he would be able to speak directly to both the United States and China and do so on an absolutely equal footing, which is without a doubt absolutely strategically significant. This does not align with China's interests. Yes, this position is covert.
China talks about friendship but only acts when it benefits them. They profit from Russia, strengthen their own influence, and at the same time build relations with the US. Meanwhile, Moscow is becoming increasingly dependent on Beijing's decisions.
Adam Kadyrov is 18. Now the unhinged son of a criminal father is officially an adult. Details of his creative journey and his vague plans for the future are covered in the next segment. And don't forget to like this episode and subscribe to the Ukraine Today YouTube channel. In
Chechnya, it's a celebration. Adam Kadyrov has turned 18. His coming of age is marked not just by congratulations but by a whole set of symbols, as if this date carries a political undertone. Ramzan Kadyrov offered words of support to his son, once again emphasizing that Adam Kadyrov is an important figure in both the family and the public sphere. Now the younger Kadyrov is officially an adult, but it feels like in the public eye he has long been portrayed differently, bigger, louder, and more significant than his actual age. Since
November 2023, he has served as the head of the department ensuring his father's security service, and in April 2025, he became the head of the Regional Security Council. Considering that his father also worked in security for the previous president, there is a strong possibility that Ramzan is grooming him as his successor.
Every appearance in official footage, every congratulation, every joint public appearance seems to weave him into the future scenario. And his father's congratulation is not just a family tradition, but a gesture that once again sparks discussions about what role Kadyrov's son might take on in the future.
Radom was promoted to curator of the Chechen Ministry of Internal Affairs and then to secretary of the Republic's Security Council, a position for which he is also unqualified due to his age, not just objectively, but even by the formal criteria set for such roles. In other words, a teenager who became known for beating a helpless detainee has made a meteoric career and received the highest honors.
The list of awards and titles that Adam received by the age of 18 is striking not for the scale of his achievements, which are little known, but for the speed at which he accumulated them. It's almost a phenomenon in itself, such a young age and yet such a list of official distinctions. However, the question of his merits before the country remains open.
Adam is not known as a romantic young man at all, but as someone who has already used violence in practice. As you may recall, 2 years ago, at the age of 15, Adam personally beat up a detainee in a pretrial detention center, the well-known blogger Nikita Zhuravel. Any other teenager would have ended up in a juvenile detention facility for something like that. But in the case of Kadyrov Jr., the opposite happened. He was rewarded.
Every time Ramzan Kadyrov publicly acknowledges his son, the topic of succession resurfaces. It's not that there are any direct official statements, but the hints, the nuances, and the way the footage is presented all create the impression that a political succession is being shaped. Given that other members of the Kadyrov clan also hold power, everything becomes perfectly clear.
As the publication project has established, he has 96 relatives, not just existing, but placed in important and lucrative positions.
Adam is not just a family member, but part of a structure that has been forming for a long time and in a very deliberate way. Adam's recent wedding also turned out to be a public event of significant scale. For some, it's a sign of coming of age and adherence to tradition. For others, it's yet another detail in the carefully crafted image. However, the scale of that wedding raised quite a few questions.
Expensive watches and cars for the offspring of the Chechen little Tsar, who despises the law, is that really what they think is worth dying for? In addition to violating the sanctions regime, there is also clear disregard for Russian laws. Adam Kadyrov has not yet reached adulthood. He will only turn 18 on November 24th. Nevertheless, he was boldly driving a car, even though Russian laws prohibit obtaining a driver's license before the age of 18. And
so Adam Kadyrov is reaching adulthood in a position that can hardly be called the result of a personal journey. He is surrounded by awards, titles, and public gestures that say much more about the system than about him personally. Adam Kadyrov, Allahu Akbar.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.